In the beginning, there was nothing. Time, space, even reality as we know it today did not exist. There was only the vast emptiness known as the Void. This Void was the home to a group of entities, having no form or sentience. They were known as the Watchers. In time, this vast and silent emptiness would spark its own creation. Seemingly endless pockets of reality, one of which would become known as the Prime universe of Runeterra. With this initial spark of creation came the very first sentient beings. Known as the Celestials, these powerful, enigmatic beings would live in an empty, vast space around them, some taking on the form of powerful beings or dragons even, while others choosing to remain completely formless, sometimes even utilizing vessels to give them a more physical appearance. One of these Celestials that took on the form of a dragon would be known as Aurelian Soul. Aurelian Soul chose to populate the emptiness around himself with stars, forging entire universes. Reality, now containing stars, worlds, and even sound, began to expand into the nothingness of the Void. This would upset the previously eternal slumbering Watchers as they were awoken by all the activity happening around them. The Watchers would become greatly annoyed by all the activity coming from the newly formed universes around them, ultimately awakening them and bringing them out from their life of non-existence. It was at this point that the Watchers decided to begin planning a way to invade and eventually completely destroy the Celestials and all reality with them. At some point later, a beautiful and life-giving planet known as Runeterra was formed using world runes. This planet orbited one of the stars created by Aurelian Soul. It also had two of its own moons, one that would inhabit the physical realm and one that would orbit in the spiritual realm itself. As the world of Runeterra was forged, along with its creation came two separate realms. The physical realm, which would home the material manifestation of Runeterra, along with all of the elemental magic, and eventually all of the mortal races that would inhabit it. And the spiritual realm, which is a spiritual parallel existence where time and space would be obscured and would be the source of all spiritual magic found on Runeterra. During these early years of Runeterra's existence, some of the earliest forms of life would begin to appear within the spirit realm, these being the various forms of primordial spirits. The Primordials consisted of the primordial spirit gods, who would govern over concepts such as life and death even. Primordial demons too, a race of spirits that have no inherent form, who malign and manipulate their victims to sate their own desires for suffering. And finally, we had the primordial Yordles, whom would establish the primitive Bandle city around the Bandlewood tree and begin constructing a gateway system that would connect the spiritual and physical realms through an intricate system of portals. As the first signs of flora and fauna appeared in the physical realm of Runeterra, such as terrestrial dragons, the contemporary continents and isles began to form on the planet's surface. After many years, the first civilizations would begin to form deep under the planet's oceans in the Guardian Sea. Many more civilizations would begin to arrive after this point, with them creating many technologies, factions, and even wars. Some time after the initial sapient marine species started to pop up in the Guardian Sea, a new civilization of demigods would come to be known in the northern frozen lands. These demigods would begin to terraform the land known as Vorijaard. Most of our understanding about these demigods comes from myths, fables, and legends passed down through many generations. Though the validity of these tales is up for debate, it's still no doubt that the demigods had a major hand in the formation of the land that would soon become known as the Freljord. Many thousands of years later, new mortal species would begin to pop up all over the lands of Runeterra. Trolls, minotaurs, yetis, and most notably for the future of Runeterra, the humans. The humans would gather into many settlements and tribes, creating a vast network of civilizations that would cover the lands of Runeterra. These humans would quickly become the most common and widespread of the many races found on Runeterra, settling in nearly every single corner of the world, some corners even being long forgotten in time. Some of the first kingdoms of Runeterra that still stand today would begin to arise around this time. The humans of ancient Ionia, known as the First Lands at this time would begin to adapt their environment and live harmoniously with the spirit realm. Around this same time, they would gain notice from the spirit Yordles, eventually living openly among these various mortal civilizations. The humans that settled in the northern lands of Vorijaard would gather into various tribes and begin worshipping the Freljordian demigods that shaped the lands. On an unknown continent in the eastern hemisphere of Runeterra, another group of humans began to settle, some of which would eventually become the ancient and now lost kingdom of Camivor. As the many mortal civilizations began to settle into their respecting lands of Runeterra, the kingdoms under the sea would begin to slowly disappear. Not much is known about what exactly caused this disappearance, but some say a rising amount of predators in the sea or even a migration to the land masses may have caused their rapture. That said, there are many scattered ruins along the ocean floor and can still be found in the seas today for those brave enough to explore them. The humans of the First Lands would soon find themselves facing a threat that they could never have expected. Across the island continent now known as Ionia, a great war raged between the mortals and a race of giants that came down from the sky. To defend themselves against these titans, the ever so enlightened mortals of Ionia took the power of the spirit realm into themselves and became the first Vastaya Shurima. The powers they gained from tapping into the spirit realm granted them near immortality, potent shape-shifting powers, and the ability to use the natural world as a weapon in order to fight the ever-encroaching titans. After the intense, lengthy, and grueling battles known as the Titan War, the Vastaya Shurima would find themselves victorious, many of them becoming known as great war heroes. The remains of this war are found across Ionia in the form of mysterious ancient ruins and battlefields. These come in the form of giant weapons left behind and statuesque ruins that potentially resemble or even are the remains of these giants. The Vastaya Shurima eventually decided to live among their mortal kin, crossbreeding as their less magical descendants would eventually be known as the more common Vastaya. These Vastaya would gather into tribes and cultural identities named after their Vastaya Shurima ancestors, with some of them migrating to lands outside of Ionia. While the Ionians fought their war on their island continent, a group of humans known as the Hearthblood began to settle in the northern lands of the Freljord, dedicating their lives to crafting various weapons, tools, and other objects as worship to Ornn, the Freljordian demigod of forging and craftsmanship, who they considered their patron with the goal of reaching his idea of perfection. It was during this time that 3 Freljordian sisters were born into a time of wilder magic. The 3 dedicated their lives to search for a way to control the powerful magical forces of the world. Sorilda attempted to command the heavens above them, but lost her voice to the first twilight. Avarosa faced the twisted dark beneath the world and was deafened by its emptiness. But Lysandra stood against the wild magic of the world, seeking to control the natural magic of the demigods themselves. One of these more warlike demigods, Vorijaard, was vocally angered by the 3 sisters' defiance and their conquest for power, while many of the other gods sought to reason with these sisters. Vorijaard, being enraged by the sisters' attempt to control the demigod's magic, sought the help of his older brother Ornn to forge weapons and armor for his Ursine army. Ornn, seeking to reason with the mortal humans, refused his younger brother. A horrific fight erupted between the 2 brothers, eventually leading to Vorijaard cursing his brother's name, stripping himself of his rune-inscribed armor, and destroying Ornn's followers, the devoted Hearthblood. Emboldened by his rage, Vorijaard confronted Lysandra in battle. He would eventually overpower her, striking her down and slashing her eyes, blinding her in front of her army. The 3 sisters, Sorilda now mute, Avarosa deaf, and Lysandra blind, had now given up on their respective conquests. Lysandra, still wishing to gain control of the powers that the demigods wielded, resorted to the art of dreamwalking. Using this skill, she was able to communicate with the Watchers, the ancient beings of the void. Unknown to her sisters, Lysandra would strike a deal with the Watchers, granting her and her sisters near immortality and the power to take back the Freljord from these demigods. As with all great powers though, the Watchers granted these powers in exchange for preparing Runeterra for the arrival of the void. With their newfound power though, the three sisters would unite the Freljord and begin their conquest to defeat the Freljordian demigods. Shortly after the defeat of these demigods, the sisters would begin discussing their arrangement with the Watchers. Sorilda and Avarosa deeming their servitude as a fate far worse than death itself. Not only were they in debt to the Watchers, but as time went on, the Freljord would become even more hospitable. The winds would grow colder and the sky would begin to darken. As the Freljord became more inhospitable, the sisters would separate, and the mortal iceborne tribes who had once fought side by side to defeat the demigods would now begin warring against each other. As their wars raged on, Sorilda and Avarosa would gather both of their armies to march on Lysandra's army, bunkered away in the Frostguard Citadel to resist serving the Watchers that Lysandra had pledged them to. Sorilda and Avarosa's armies would begin sieging the Frostguard Citadel, eventually meeting Lysandra and her armies upon the bridge that towered over the Howling Abyss. As the armies began to clash upon the bridge, the sky would grow dark. A frostbitten wind gusted across the bridge, and it was at this time that the Watchers would begin to materialize across the Freljord and Howling Abyss, causing complete chaos across the lands as these horrific, eldritch horrors finally began reaching into the physical realm. Watching the horrors manifest before her, Lysandra began to realize the magnitude of the mistake she had made in striking this deal with the Watchers. In an attempt to protect the land of the Freljord and Runeterra as a whole, Lysandra, in a last-ditch effort, did the unthinkable to stop the Watchers from fully materializing. Sacrificing her sisters and all their armies gathered within the Howling Abyss, she enacted a ritual to entomb the Watchers in true ice, succeeding in imprisoning them halfway between the void and the physical realm. Lysandra would try to keep this history of the frozen Watchers away from the rest of the world, hoping that these Watchers trapped between two realms and frozen in true ice would be forgotten about. To this day, Lysandra remains in power, secretly, hidden deep within the Freljord. Many thousands of years after the three sisters, movement would start to occur in the most distant eastern islands of Runeterra, bringing all their ancient knowledge and wisdom with them. Settlers from the forgotten lands of the distant east would begin reaching the shores of Shurima and Valoran. This dispersion of mortal humans from the ancient homelands would start the creation of some of the greatest civilizations Runeterra has ever known. A group of humans called the Buru would settle on these Serpent Isles, worshipping and eventually managing to utilize the power of the immensely powerful spirit god of the ocean, Nagakaburus. An enlightened society of educated scholars and philosophers whom dedicated themselves to discovering the mysteries of Runeterra would form on the Blessed Isles after encountering the nature spirit Maokai, who had gifted them with the location of the blessed waters of life due to their respect for the lands and its magic. Ishokan would be built as the capital city of Ishtal in the Shuriman jungle, a hub for those dedicating their lives to mastering elemental magic. To the west, in the deserts of Shurima, the great nation of Shurima would be founded, eventually leading themselves into a golden age. Even further west, mortals would discover the great Mount Targon. Here they would create a tribal theocracy centered around the celestial powers that created the mountain, eventually tricking our friend Aurelian's soul into servitude. And then, not too long after the founding of Shurima, a port named Oshavazan would open, connecting the northern continent of Valoran with its southern sister continent, Shurima. On the southern peninsula of Shurima, under a mage king, the rebellious mage-led government of Acathia would be born. This resettling of mortal humans across the lands would stir up many advancements in technologies and magics, as well as trade between the far east, north, and southern regions of Runeterra. At the time of the migration, these new settlers were oftentimes far more advanced magically than those in the First Lands or the Freljord, causing future conflicts and even destruction. As these new nations began to settle in their respecting corners of Runeterra, one nation developing its magics through assistance from the aspects themselves would reach a level of near godlike power that would endure for millennia to come. In a time before the Sun Empire rose to prominence, the old city of Neramazeth was the capital of Shurima. It was here that sun worshippers made the first iteration of a sun disk, guided by the divine aspects of Targon in preparation for some unknown future war. These ancient Shurimans would use the sun disk to undergo a transformative ritual, giving them extraordinary power and a long life, so they could safeguard their nation and its interests. These noble ascended, also known as the Sunborn, were worshipped as living gods and would help to form the great Shuriman Empire. The warrior queen Sataka would become one of the very first ascended, wielding the gifted Kalikar, a weapon brought from beyond the mountain and raised aloft at Shurima's birth. It was said that entire war campaigns could be won the moment a god warrior took to the battlefield, because their foes chose to turn and flee rather than face them directly. These ascended would lead the great empire into a millennia of strength, growth, and prosperity. The ascension ritual is usually decided upon by the sun priest through criteria that are mystical and governed by ritual and superstition, and usually it's granted to those who have selflessly served Shurima and are being given the chance to do so even after what normally would be their time to die. The process of ascension, though, was not a perfect science. While sometimes the ascension would raise strong, near perfect god warriors, other times it could fail altogether, killing the host. Usually, it would be somewhere in between. After one of these failed ascensions, the sun disk of Neramazeth would be destroyed, though the Shurimans, not being a culture to give up easily, would build a larger and more powerful sun disk in the current Shuriman capital, likely with help from the Ishtali mages. After its construction, an oasis would appear inside the structure. Its life-giving water would pour into the surrounding areas, giving life to the desert, and later creating a sprawling river system named the Mother of Life River. It was around this time that Shurima would name its first emperor, and the empire would end up absorbing a great deal of nations and cities as vassal states, some of these including Ishtal and Oshra-Vazan. Eventually, the Shuriman Emperor would set his eyes on the south and the nation of Akathia. Despite the Mage King's call for a peaceful coexistence, Akathia would eventually be subjugated to the Shuriman Empire and their ascended god warriors. Soon after conquering Akathia, the Shuriman Empire would begin abolishing of worship of any deities other than their own ascended, making the others as false idols. Hundreds of years later, the Council of Akathia would submit countless petitions to the Shuriman Emperor, asking for some of its most noble and notable citizens to be granted the gift of ascension and gaining the vassal state of Akathia, some say in the empire that had consumed them, though all of these petitions would be denied or ignored. Hostilities and anger towards Shurima would grow with each failed petition, often denied without any explanation. The Akathian leadership would in turn attempt to seek independence from the Shuriman Empire, seeking allies in Ishtal and other neighboring states. All fearing the power of Shurima and its ascended would decline an alliance. Being pushed in a corner by the tight grip of the Shuriman Empire, Akathia would make a desperate attempt to succeed. A large earthquake would hit the lands of Akathia. A group of mages would find an unearthed void rift. These mages would seek to utilize this discovery in Akathia's push for independence, voting to weaponize it against their oppressors. The Council of Akathia, as a message of independence from the Shuriman Empire, would crown a new Mage King and re-establish the Kahari Order, a Mage King's personal guard. Loyal citizens of Shurima would either be killed or banished from Akathia. Akathian citizens would loot and pillage Shuriman homes and settlements within Akathian territories. In a strong response to this uprising, the Shuriman Emperor would send in a group of Shuriman Ascended, possibly led by Sataka herself. A massive Shuriman army would find itself at Akathia's door. In an attempt to use the void against their adversaries, the Council of Akathia accidentally opened a giant void rift, causing countless Voidborn to seep into the physical realm and ultimately tainting the land itself. A massive battle between the Voidborn and the Ascended ensued. Some of these Ascended would even die in battle, such as Sataka. Nezuk, a god warrior of Ishtal, went to the Shuriman emperor and pleaded to create a weapon that would be powerful enough to stop the void, eventually creating a floating fortress of living stone maintained by the greatest mages of the Ishtali god warriors. Bringing the super weapon down to Icathia, they would fight the void. After weeks of endless battles, the giant monolith would eventually fall, much of the fortress being lost into the gaping maw that had been created, vanishing into the silent nothingness below. Wishing to preserve their nation from losing any more of the growing threat of the void, Ishtal mages would grow the wilderness around them like a shield, isolating Ashokan from the rest of the world. In a desperate solution against the void, the Netherblade would be created and wielded by Horok, an ascended warrior who would then delve deep into the underground void tunnels, attacking the rifts at their core and eventually turning the tide of the war. Shabaka and Shabak, ascended twins with the heads of ravens, would eventually help seal the Great Rift of Icathia, ultimately halting the spread of the void. Seemingly ending this spread and losing its allies in Ishtal, the Shuriman Empire would attempt to rebuild and ultimately fall after the Great Void War. While still recovering from the Void War, Shurima would lay siege to the city of Nashrame, with Nasus and Renekton at the helm. Renekton would lose himself during the battle and nearly burn the whole city to the ground, Nasus eventually stopping him. During an assault, all of the sons of the then current emperor would be killed, all but one, the emperor's least favorite, Azir. Xerath, a man born a nameless slave, would protect him and ultimately save his life. Azir, being eternally grateful, would promise Xerath that he would free him and all of the other slaves once he became emperor. Now, next in line to the throne, Azir was only a heartbeat away from fulfilling his promise. As the years would pass, Xerath would take dark steps to ensure the Emperor would not have another son to take Azir's place, as the Emperor did not favor Azir. Using his nascent magical abilities, Xerath would corrupt every infant that would enter the Emperor's wife's womb, causing them all to be stillborn. Despite Xerath's best efforts to thwart the Queen's midwives, a new Prince of Shurima was brought into the world, but on the night of his birth, Xerath used his growing magical powers to summon the elemental spirits of the deep desert and craft a terrible storm, ultimately killing the Queen. The Emperor, being present, forced Xerath to kill him as well. Now, with Azir on the throne, Xerath would then expect freedom of himself and the other slaves. However, Azir instead would focus on making Shurima an even more expansive empire and deflect any of Xerath's mentions about it. Xerath would then decide to steal the throne from Azir as revenge. However, in secret, Azir began to formulate his plan on how to free all of the slaves. Azir announced he would undertake the Ascension ritual, that he had earned the right to stand alongside Nasus and Renekton as an ascended being. The Sun Priests protested, but such was Azir's hubris that he ordered them to comply on pain of torture and death. The day of Ascension arrived and Azir marched towards the dais of Ascension with Xerath at his side. Azir stood beneath the sun disk, and in the final moment before the priests began the ritual, events took a turn Xerath had not anticipated. The Emperor turned to Xerath and told him that he was now a free man. He and all Shurima's slaves were now released from their bonds of servitude. The Emperor's words pierced the bitterness enclosing Xerath's heart, but it had come too late, as Xerath's plans were already in motion. With a roar of anger and grief combined, Xerath blasted Azir from his place on the dais, watching through tears as his former friend burned to ash. Xerath then took Azir's place, and the light of the sun filled him, reshaping his flesh into that of an ascended being. But the power of the ritual was not his to take, and the consequences of his betrayal of Azir were devastating. The unbound power of the sun all but destroyed Shurima, sundering its temples and bringing ruination upon the city. Azir's people were consumed in a terrifying conflagration as the desert rose up to claim the city. The sun disk would then fall, and an empire built by generations of emperors was undone in a single day. The sun disk and the Shuriman capital, now with no power left in them, would sink beneath the sands to be lost in time with the powerful empire that was once known as Shurima. The ascended god warriors would control Runeterra for centuries of uneasy alliance. Having no emperor to lead them, many would attempt more insidious ambitions, viewing themselves as the rightful inheritors of the world world, they would enslave many of the mortal races and form them to worship them. Bereft of purpose and scarred by what they had endured in facing the void, many of the Ascended became twisted in body and mind, naming themselves the Darkin and raising hordes of mortal warriors to conquer the world. These Darkin mastered many forbidden forms of primal magic, crafting their own flesh and armor with equal ease until they are completely unrecognizable as the noble warriors they once had been. With no purpose left, these Darkin would begin to clash with each other. Eventually, the aspects who had inspired their creation in the first place were forced to intervene, imprisoning the Darkin within their own accursed weapons. The last Darkin, Varus, would be defeated and sealed away within his magical bow by Vastayan moonstalkers and human mages in service of a golden armored warrior queen, ending the Great Darkin War. With the Darkin dealt with for the time being at least, the lands of Runeterra were open to another power to come in and take hold. Many lifetimes ago, a fierce warlord named San Uzal rampaged across the northern wildlands. Driven by dark faith, he crushed every tribe and settlement in his path, forging an empire in blood and death. As his mortal life neared its end, he took great satisfaction in knowing he had doubtless earned a seat at the gods' table in the glorious Hall of Bones for all eternity. Yet, when he died, he found no halls of glory awaiting him on the other side. He grew increasingly bored of the afterlife, and soon, after the Darkin had been locked away, he began to call out beyond the veil, tempting those who may help him with endless strength. Eventually, a coven of sorcerers would agree to bring him back to life. He urged them to make him stronger than any mortal, as he was lacking any flesh or bone. They bound his spirit form into dark metal plates, wrought in the likeness of his old armor. The sorcerers had hoped to use him to fight in their petty wars, but San Uzal had different plans. Being raised as Mordekaiser, he slew the sorcerers where they stood, their armor and weapons showing to be completely useless against him. With his soul being completely restored into his new armor, Mordekaiser would begin his crusade across the lands, now forming a new and more powerful empire and constructing the immortal bastion in the northeast. During his conquest, Mordekaiser crushed and enslaved all who opposed his rule, conquering much of the land. At the height of Mordekaiser's dark reign, it was said that mythic and bloodthirsty fiends haunted the coastal cliffs of eastern Valoran, demanding young lives and savage worship from the local tribes. Then, one day a pale sorceress would approach the barbarian god Mordekaiser with an offer. The two would then feast together as equals, weaving magic so dark that it is said the wine on their tables would sour and the vibrant red roses in the halls would wither to black. This encounter would later serve as the basis for a secret underground Noxai society with his pale sorceress as its matron. Mordekaiser would eventually be defeated after being betrayed by this same pale sorceress, now part of his inner circle. A hidden cabal would manage to sever the anchors that sealed his soul within his armor, eventually hiding his empty iron armor away and placing his soul in the Hall of Bones, where they would amass power for centuries to come. Only half a century after the fall of Mordekaiser, a new change to the geography of Runeterra was about to occur in the southeastern Blessed Isles. Shortly after the death of the king of Camivor, his brother Viego would take up the throne and become the new king. Soon after his coronation, he would fall madly in love with a humble seamstress. Viego and the seamstress would have a whirlwind romance and quickly wed. Unable to focus on governing his country, he would focus on pleasing his new wife and fulfilling her every whim. Viego's enemies would begin to plot in secret due to his questionable leadership. His enemies would hire an assassin to snuff out the young king's life and nearly succeed if not for the speed of his general Callista. However, in saving his life, the assassin's blade, tipped with poison, would instead come in contact with the queen, dooming her to a certain death. Viego would begin his search high and low for a cure, summoning the most profound scholars and doctors from across the land, none having a cure for his queen. Viego then would send Callista off to search for a cure, having his new guard Hecarim replace her in her leave, eventually sailing to the Blessed Isles where she had heard of a long-lost waters of life. The island's inhabitants accepted Callista's request and asked her to bring the queen to the island, where they would cleanse her. However, they made her promise not to reveal the secrets of the island to others. While Callista was away, Viego would descend into madness, locking himself away in a tower with his queen until she would eventually die. Being unable to lead his kingdom in this time, it would fall into complete and utter chaos, many completely protesting his reign. The king would then order Hecarim to squash any and all insurrection. It was around this time that Callista would return from her journey to find she was too late and the queen had already passed away. Viego would ask her what she had found, but knowing she was too late and seeing the mental state of the king himself, she refused to reveal what she had discovered. With Viego not being in the right mental state, he would name Callista a traitor. In a fit of rage, Viego would set sail for the Blessed Isles with his armies, eventually asking the island's guardians to resurrect his queen. The guardians of the Isles would refuse, sending Viego deeper into his fit of rage, forcing Callista and Hecarim to destroy the city. Callista would then refuse, and Hecarim would betray her by stabbing her with a spear and killing the soldiers that were loyal to her. Hecarim would then move forward with Viego's plans and completely destroy the city. Through this destruction, Viego would be guided to the waters by a custodian who would later be known as Thresh, eventually lowering the queen into the healing waters. But the ritual would only be a half success, bringing the queen back to life, but as a horrifying wraith. Being confused and filled with anger and pain, Viego's bride would take his enchanted blade and lunge it through his heart, plunging them both deep beneath the healing waters. The magic of these healing waters and the enchanted sword would clash, transforming the area around it into a black mist. The magical energy would erupt, tearing across the land, corrupting the island and all of its inhabitants. Hecarim and his knights would attempt to flee, but were caught in the shockwave, fusing the riders and their steeds, transforming them into spectral riders. This shattering would break the barrier between the material and the spiritual realms. The souls of the dead would be trapped in eternal torment with the coiling black mist. The Blessed Isles would now be forever lost within the black mist, and would be known from this day forward as the Shadow Isles, completely being abandoned by all right-thinking mortals. Now, with Helia lost and the Blessed Isles being transformed into the Shadow Isles, the ancient order that was trusted with the responsibility of gathering and protecting Runeterra's most dangerous artifacts would be left in shambles. Struggling to keep the knowledge of these world runes hidden, political tension would follow. The now vast developing nations would grow unwilling to trust one another with these runes for fear of being destroyed by their rivals. These nations would grow increasingly fearful of each other over time, and a short period of calmness would occur due to a fear of mutually assured destruction, though this period would only last a little over a decade. In spite of this protective order's best efforts, knowledge of the runes would begin to spread. Few could even begin to understand their importance or the sheer power held within them, and yet all saw them as weapons that could be turned against their rivals. Ryze and Tyrus, two members of this ancient order, traveled between the various peoples of Valoran, trying to quell paranoia and encourage restraint. But over time, their missions became increasingly precarious, and Ryze could sense his master's growing desperation. Finally, in the territories where Ryze was born, the first cataclysmic blow was struck in what would eventually be known as the Rune Wars. Two nations with whom tensions had ran high and were out at the brink of destroying each other would be asked by Tyrus to parley in the village of Combe. After arriving, Tyrus and Ryze would realize that it was far too late and the conflict had already gotten beyond their abilities to mediate. Ryze and Tyrus would run to the hills and bear witness to the destructive powers of the runes. The earth would fall away beneath the village, the bedrock itself seeming to retch and squeal, while the sky above them would recoil as if it was mortally wounded. Ryze and Tyrus would look back to where the two rival armies had once stood, seeing destruction on a scale so massive that it defied all physical sense. Buildings, farms, and people were all gone. The ocean that was once a day's journey off in the distance had now rushed to meet them. Ryze fell to his knees, staring at the great hole torn into the earth, nothing left of the village he had once called home. Open warfare would soon rage across all of Runeterra. Ryze would feel compelled to join the conflict, to pick a side and lend his magical strength to the cause, but Tyrus stayed his hand, for it was up to the two of them to guide others back toward peace and pray there was anything left of the world by the time it was all over. As the conflict would spread, Ryze noticed his master growing more distant. Eventually, Ryze decided to confront him and, to his horror, discovered that Tyrus had secretly come into possession of not one, but two runes. The allure of the runes had left its mark upon him. Where once he desired only peace, now he had the means to bring about the end of all things. Rise had to act, even if it meant destroying his only true friend and ally in the world. In an instant, he unleashed all the magic he could muster, and a moment later, Pyrrhus's corpse lay smoldering on the floor. Soon, the greatest civilizations would all but destroy one another, eventually ending the war, leading to Rise now fully understanding the task with which he had inherited. As long as any world rune remained unsecured, Runeterra was surely doomed. This knowledge was to become a lonely burden indeed, for ever since that day, he has scoured the world in search of the last remaining runes. He continues to reject the promise of power within each one, choosing instead to bind them in secret locations, far from prying and greedy eyes. Refugees of the Rune Wars would find a land with magic nullifying petricite and settle there, eventually becoming the great nation of Demacia. And from the ashes of the Rune Wars, many other great nations would begin to rise. In the northeast, the Noxide tribes, being forced to retreat into the Immortal Bastion by the magical fallout, would eventually emerge as the unified nation of Noxus, making this emergence as year 0 on the standard and most common calendar in Runeterra. Noxus, now growing ever ambitious, would swear to unite all the nations of Runeterra under a single flag, sometimes even forcefully. Far to the west, the nation of Demacia would crown its first king, Orlon. Settling in magic nullifying petricite, Demacia would be a sanctuary far away from the magics that had all but destroyed the world in the Rune Wars. Merchant clans controlling the trader routes between Valoran and Shurima would finalize plans to destroy the lands connecting the two continents, allowing safe sea passage between the two. Using thousands of chemtech bombs to create the passage, the results would be a little bit catastrophic. These bombs would trigger a series of earthquakes, tragically sinking large districts of Zon and its citizens into the poisonous gases. Janna, a Shuriman spirit goddess, would hear the prayers of the Zonites and arrive to blow away much of the poisonous gases and save many thousands of people. Eventually, Zon would be rebuilt. The regulation of the newfound oceanic passageways would bring great wealth to the city, and likely led to the construction of Piltover, built over top of the sunken Zon. Progress Day would be celebrated as the anniversary of the opening of these gates. Immigrants and refugees from Demacia, Freljord, and Ionia would travel and settle in the Serpent Isles. The Buru would allow these settlers to settle in the southern bays. This settlement would eventually grow into the bustling city port of Bilgewater. Many wars would be fought between the growing nations and small tribes, bringing us into the modern day of Runeterra. Whether it was Noxus's massive expansion being halted by Demacia, or Piltover itself making massive and insane scientific advancements, the world of Runeterra would forever continue to grow and change, bringing us into modern day. Thank you all for coming along with me on this wild ride, tracking and traversing all of Runeterra, its previous history, and I guess let's keep making videos and see where it's going to take us in the future. I want to continue this series by kind of beginning speculation on what is going to come next, especially when it pertains to the Riot MMO and what the storyline may look like. So if you're into that kind of thing, make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube, and I will keep you all updated with massive amounts of videos in the coming weeks, months, years, decades, however long it takes for this game to come out. Thank you all for coming by. I will see you in the next video. Peace.